Hi, and welcome to today's session of Lunches with Legends, where we chat with some of the most illustrious individuals in the financial world while supporting the health and wellness of our communities. If you have not already made your donation, please take a moment, go to the donation page at the top right of this site. As a reminder, 100% of the proceeds and 100% of the dollars you donate will go toward COVID-19 relief and pediatric mental health. So we would greatly appreciate your support. Just before we begin, I also want to thank our generous sponsors of this series, particularly our Gold Series sponsor, KPMG. We are deeply grateful to KPMG for their friendship and very generous support. We would also like to thank our 3 Silver Series sponsors, Ventura Realty, Cregan McConnell Group, and TD Bank. We are incredibly grateful and appreciative for your generosity. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our very special guest today, Dr. Mohamed El-Erian. Mohamed's bio and his many accolades would take a half hour to read, but given Mohamed's extraordinary humility, I'll save him the discomfort and offer an abridged bio instead. So after completing his master's at Cambridge and his PhD in economics at Oxford, Mohamed began his career at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and quickly rose to the ranks of deputy director. After the IMF and a stint in the private sector, Mohamed was appointed president and CEO of the Harvard Management Company, overseeing Harvard University's endowment in financial assets. He also served as a member of the faculty of the Harvard Business School, and I believe he still serves on Harvard's Global Advisory Council. Mohamed subsequently became the CEO and co-CIO of PIMCO, where he helped grow the asset base to $2 trillion during his tenure. And he continues to serve as the chief economic advisor to Allianz, which is the parent company of PIMCO. Mohamed is a prolific writer, with his publications appearing in virtually every financial media outlet and his award-winning books being on the shelves of some of the most thoughtful market participants. His most recent book, The Only Game in Town, Central Banks Instability and Avoiding the Next Collapse, is a New York Times bestseller, which, by the way, I'd recommend everyone here check out. And currently, Mohamed serves as the president of Queen's College, Cambridge. He's a senior global fellow at the Lauder Institute, a professor at Wharton, and an advisor to a number of distinguished organizations. He has been consistently included in the lists of the top global thinkers, the 100 most powerful people in finance, top global economists, and among the most influential leaders and thought leaders in the world. Mohamed, we are truly honored to have you with us today. And the conversation with Mohamed will be moderated by John Culbertson, who serves as the president and chief investment officer of Context Capital Partners, a great organization and one of the generous sponsors of Lunches with Legends. John is a veteran of the financial service industry and having experience spanning the gamut of trading, venture capital, asset allocation, hedge fund portfolio management, etc. And prior to assuming his current position with Context, John was a chief investment officer for a large family office and was previously the founder of Gamma Investors. John, thank you very much to you and your entire team at Context for supporting Lunches with Legends, and we look forward to your conversation with Mohamed. With that, I'll invite you both to take it away.
Thank you, Mo, and thank you, Mohamed, for doing this. It's great to be with you again. Mohamed, before we start, I want to just personally thank you for being such a steady, consistent voice of reason in a year that at times felt like just utter chaos. I think in the crescendo of fear and panic in March and April of this year, you were on Bloomberg and CNBC and the FT, writing, speaking almost daily, offering advice and guidance. And I know I speak for my peers and just saying thank you for the role you played in this year. So, Mohamed, you have a new job. I hear you have a new job, but it's not the defensive coordinator for the Jets. I heard you made the short list after this weekend, but they chose someone else, I think. I'm sorry, Mohamed. 0-12. I'm sorry. It's been a tough year. Seriously, you are the president of Queen's College at Cambridge. I know you have a long history at Cambridge. Congratulations. Tell us a little bit about how that position came to be and what the role was really about.
Okay, so first, John, let me say I was going to thank you for your kind introduction, and I was going to thank you for everything that you do and that colleagues at Context do, but you blew it. You totally blew it. By mentioning the Jets, especially after the very, very painful loss on Sunday, you just blew it. So I'm not going to thank you, but I will thank Mo. Mo, thank you for what you do. Thank you for helping so many. It really is consequential. And thank you everybody on this call for helping so many people. So in order to understand where I've ended up, you have to go back. I'm a 22-year-old. I'm doing my doctorate at Oxford. I know exactly what I was going to do, which is I was going to be an academic. I was excited. And my father suddenly dies of a heart attack. My mother had never worked, and I have a 7-year-old sister. So all the plans that I had put in place went out the window, and I started optimizing a very simple utility function. Who pays economists? That's what it was. Who pays graduate economists? Universities did not pay very much, but there were two institutions that did pay graduate economists at the time, the IMF and the World Bank. And I ended up joining the IMF, which I've been fortunate. In fact, I've been fortunate throughout my life that every professional decision I've made has been incredible. So that is sort of the detour I took. And then when I left PIMCO in 2014 and thought, what would I do next? I decided I would only do something where I felt that it would be transformational for others. And I can tell you that nothing is more transformational in my mind than an education at a place like Queen's and Cambridge University. I went through it. I knew how I started. I knew how I ended up. And if I can help do what this college does extremely well, which is access participation, help people from low income backgrounds get access to that education, you transform not only their lives, you transform multiple generations' lives. So, that is what attracted me back. I didn't know that I would be in the business of COVID management full time, but it is the fact that this is a college that really cares about diversity and inclusion. And it cares so much, John, just to give you a feeling, is that it has local presence in disadvantaged community. And it reaches into the school think of 9th grade, 8th grade, to encourage people to think big, encourage them to think, because often they don't think big because they're told not to think big. And then to help the teachers, it brings the teachers to Cambridge to sit in interviews of other students to demystify the process. And by breaking down these obstacles, you can literally transform generations.
It's such a great story, Mohamed. It really is. It's such a great story. I'd like to talk a little bit about leadership. You touched on a little bit of this in your last comments, but you've been a leader in the public companies, private educational institutions, your entire career. I personally think that we're in some sort of global leadership vacuum or a void, unfortunately, and it cuts across every facet of life. It's religious and political, economic, social. Can you talk a little bit about Mohamed El-Erian's leadership principles and what and who in your life has influenced you in the way you think about leadership?
So I'll get to who influenced me at the end, if I may. Look, when I grew up, I had lots of bosses. And the bosses basically fell into three categories. Those who led by fear. And I had a few of those. And I didn't like it. I really did not like having a boss that led by fear. Those who led by pure inspiration or had something incredibly special about them. I had a few of those. They're incredible, but there aren't that many out there. And then the third category were those who led by example. You know that they would do what you had to do, that they understood what you were going through, and that they were sympathetic, empathetic, but also understood what leadership was around. So when I became a leader, quote unquote, I decided that's the sort of model I want to pursue. I want to lead by example. I want to lead by involvement. And at no point would anybody I lead feel that I wouldn't do what they're doing. In fact, I want them to think that I'm actually working a lot harder than they are. That was my very simple leadership principle. I then said, what are the conditions to do this? One is commit to it and deliver. So work hard, understand, have an open ear. Two is have cognitive diversity around the table. And I'll come back to why I'm stressing that. Understand that we all have biases, that rather than deny the biases we have, there's good scientific reasons why we have them, overcome them by bringing other people in the room with different perspectives. And third, communicate. Who had the biggest influence on me? It was my dad. You know, I was a 13-year-old. My father had gone from being a civil servant to being a diplomat. He was drafted into the Egyptian diplomatic service, and he was posted to France. So here we are in Paris. I'm a 13-year-old. We get 4 different newspapers every day. And my father would insist on me reading them. I had no interest in reading a single newspaper, okay, let alone reading 4. And I remember one day being really irritated and saying that if you really want me to read a newspaper, I'll read 1. There's no point in reading 4 because the news is the news, right? I don't need to read 4. If I read 1, that should satisfy you. And he said, you're wrong. The news is the news. The interpretations are different. And unless you're willing to read 4 different newspapers, you're not going to make the right decisions. And that had a huge impact on me. And it was reinforced by all the behavioral science I studied. I'm still very intrigued in behavioral science that said that not only do we all have biases, but the leaders get tested most, as they are today, when they have to make decisions under radical uncertainty, under unusual uncertainty. And what do you need for that? It's resilience, that if you make a mistake, you can bounce back. It's an open mindset, and it's agility. And it speaks to the same thing. If you don't have people around you that are cognitively diverse, which means gender diversity, cultural diversity, education diversity, if you don't have that around you, you're going to make lots of mistakes that are non-recoverable.
It's an excellent answer, Mohamed. I was going to ask you how our educational institutions can be doing a better job of raising young leaders. And I think you answered part of that, but is there anything you'd add to that? Not just leaders in business, but leaders in life.
So first, I feel very strongly about this. What the typical educational institution provides is necessary but not sufficient. They often stop at the necessary part. Can they do the necessary part better? Yes, they can. But most educational think of themselves as providing a pretty solid foundation. But what a student emerging from a university needs is not just a foundation, but a few floors added. And then they add the few other floors. And I think that where we fall short is in adding these floors. So the first part is multidiscipline, interdisciplinary. We don't teach enough interdisciplinary stuff. Okay, the education we have today is built for my world, and I'm old. My world is basically you came out of university and you chose a ladder. You chose law, you chose finance, you chose engineering, and your parents pushed you to choose a ladder. And everybody expects you to choose a ladder. And then you spend your whole career climbing the ladder. And if you fall off the ladder, it's a complete disaster. And if you think of changing ladders, people say, are you out of your mind? That is the world I grew up in. The world today of our kids is completely different. It's more, to use Sheryl Sandberg's analogy, it's a jungle gym. They go sideways, they go diagonally, they fall, they come back up, okay? And a university that prepares you for a jungle gym is not a university that prepares you for a ladder. You need a lot more interdisciplinary stuff, a lot more. You need an understanding of the world early on. You need to bring in practitioners to talk to you. You can't just send someone out with a really big, strong foundation. And then you better have diversity. Because if you are in a place that doesn't have diversity and you get introduced to the workplace, you will make mistakes.
Very well said. Mohamed, you've been very generous too and very supportive of childhood cancer research and treatment efforts, and in particular, one hospital in Egypt, which I think is just a fantastic story. Can you talk a little bit about your interest in childhood cancer in general, but also this hospital in particular?
Yeah, so look, I am here because other people made it possible. Okay, and in particular, parents that my father, a civil servant, believe me, in Egypt, doesn't earn that much. I remember he went, a decade without buying a new suit in order to put every penny in his kids' education. So I know that most people stand on the shoulders of others. So when I was lucky enough to, feel well off, I felt strongly that it was my turn to do the same for others. And then I started like most people start, which is in a very dispersed fashion, a bit here, a bit there, a bit here, a bit there. And then I realized that what happens to a lot of really, really important initiatives is they never get to critical mass. And that if you really want to help somebody, you embrace them and you get them to critical mass and you stay with them. So then I decided, what are the two sectors I guess I care about most? Education and health. Then I asked the question within health, who do I want to focus on? And then the answer was children in developing countries. Okay. So that is how I got to it. It was very analytical. And then I came across this hospital that's special in three ways. It is recognized to provide world-class treatment in cancer. It has a survival rate that is very high up among developing countries and almost at the level of an advanced economy. Secondly, it does so for free. That it, regardless of your family circumstances, and it has a very equal access process to it. It is known not to be subject to political pressure and everything else. And it's basically because its founder is really stubborn. And then the third thing it does, it had gotten the support of a lot of citizens sending in 50 cents, $1. And I was particularly struck by the story of a young girl who is a cancer survivor, who wrote a letter back to the place. Actually, I'm sorry, her mother wrote a letter back to the place. And she said, I just want you to know that my daughter now insists that her pocket money all be sent to the hospital. And when I asked her why, she said, I never believed that people could give expecting nothing in return. And that for me was, wow, that hospital is being transformational. And I got to know it, and it was true on all three counts. And I've been a very strong supporter of that hospital. And it's not easy to be a world-class institution in a country where jealousy gets triggered. So and they have done an incredibly good job, and I'm really proud of them, and I'm proud to be associated with them.
Great. Well, your work there is amazing. It's such a great story, Mohamed. Let's transition into the mundane, into the economic world. It's been a historic year economically, just along so many dimensions. And it's not just because of the damage I think that we've seen done by the pandemic, but it's also the nuances and how the pandemic has exposed cracks and seams in the economy and in our society, really, for that matter. But it's also in some ways shown the robustness of some companies and the resilience of others, and really the amazing response of the global scientific community. It's really remarkable. Why don't we just start with you giving us a quick assessment overview of where we are currently in the global economy?
So I think in order to understand where we are, you have to just retain, I think, 4 factors. And John, you know that I tend to have what's called a reduced form equation, which is instead of trying to explain everything, find a handful of factors that explain 80%. And if you can do that, it becomes much more actionable. Otherwise, you get paralyzed trying to find what the other 20% are. So if you were trying to figure out, okay, where the global economy is today, so you're solving that equation, the global economy, you would have 4 variables. One is dispersion, different countries being at different places. And there's this very simple reason why. It's because whether you are in your family, whether you're running a country, whether you are running a company, you are trying right now to solve for public health, as normal economic and social interaction as possible, and individual freedom. And that's really hard to solve for. And the only countries that have been able to solve for that are ones that have sacrificed one of the 3 things. Okay, either they've sacrificed it because they're able to. The Koreas, the Japan, the Singapore, the Taiwan of the world have collective responsibility. So the individual freedom issue isn't that important in solving because it solves for itself, consistent with the other 2. Or alternatively, China, which says, I don't care about personal freedom. But in the US, in the UK, in Canada, wherever else you look, you're trying to solve for all 3. And it's really hard. So you get different outcomes. So we're going to have what I call V's, China, W's, Europe, and a square root in the US. And you put all this whole thing together, it's a very complicated global economy. The other thing that we've learned, I think, beyond any doubt, is that COVID is not an equal shock like we initially thought. You know, the narrative in the beginning is it doesn't matter where you are, you can get COVID. Now we've discovered actually COVID is a great unequalizer. Income distribution has got worse. The ability of people to protect themselves has got worse. Wealth inequality has gotten worse. And guess what? The inequality opportunity has gotten worse. 30% of the students in the LA school district, the second largest in the country, are no longer in touch with the school. Either they don't have Wi-Fi, computers, somewhere to work, or they're not interested. They're not coming back. That's risk being a lost generation. The third element is scarring. You'll hear economists talk a lot about that we're going to come back out, but we're going to come back out different. Lots of silver linings, I want to stress, and you just noted one, the scientists collaborating. I have a whole list of silver linings, but we're also going to have some long-term effects. And then the fourth is a great disconnect, is that finance, Wall Street, is completely disconnected from reality. And that disconnect is something that we're going to have to deal with over the next few years.
So there's so much to unpack here, Mohamed, right? So what can let's take the US, which has a particular way of managing the pandemic. What can we be doing as a society, as a country? Can we be doing to help the people that have been most affected by this, especially economically, become more resilient, become more stable? And it's not just economically, it's really across all spectrums of life. And you mentioned the school children in LA, for example. There's so many ripple effects. And I'd like to hear what you think as a policy and a practical way we could be doing as a society to be helping those people.
So I think two things, John. First and foremost, get out of the mindset that it's lives versus livelihood, health versus the economy. It's not. Okay. And we've discovered this, I think, painfully. It is not. And if you put it that way, you're going to start, continue fluctuating like a pendulum. I'm back in California for the holidays, so my daughter has somewhere to come home to. I'm back in California, and we've just gone under a stay-at-home shelter. We shut everything down again after we reopened everything, right? And we keep on thinking it's lives, but it's not. This thing solves, together. And we got to get out of that mindset, because as long as we're in that mindset, we're going to overshoot on one way, we're going to overshoot on the other way. So the first thing is how you frame the question is really important. The second issue is when we think of people that are on the receiving end, we think relief. And I can tell you, I'm very involved with the food bank here where I live. And there's massive need for relief. And you would not believe who is in line for that. I was very struck when I was told the story about the baggage handler from the airport. That baggage handler had 20 years of accumulated experience, was regarded as one of the best there. That person thought they had income for life. And if you think you have income for life, you don't save. Rational behavior, right? But they thought they had income for life, and they discovered they didn't have income for life. That's who is in, this is the sort of people who are in line in the food bank. So relief is the right thing, but it's not the only thing. And we, until now, are not doing enough to provide people with opportunities to bounce back quickly. And I can't stress how important that is, because the scarring element is something that's going to be with us. And the most important of all these are people who came out of schools, university, entered the labor force in 2020 and became immediately unemployed. And studies have shown over and over again, if you are unemployed early in your career for a long time, you risk being unemployable. You go from short-term unemployment to long-term unemployment to unemployable. And that's another lost generation. So it's the only thing I would say, one is frame it differently. And two is think beyond relief. Relief is not where it stops. Relief is an important, very important step, but think beyond that.
So do you think this looks like a series of multi-year fiscal programs, or do you think it's a combination of monetary policy, fiscal policy, and private citizens? What does this look like over the next few years, the right policy mix, Mohamed?
So it's less monetary, smarter fiscal, a lot more productivity enhancing structural reform, and engagement with the private sector. So that's what it is. Enough monetary. Monetary is actually, in my mind, counterproductive at this point. It is counterproductive. When Ben Bernanke announced back in August 2010 in Jackson Hole that we were going unconventional for not to normalize markets, not to fix dysfunctional financial markets, but to pursue economic objectives, he said, rightly, it's about, quote, benefits, costs, risks. And the longer we do this, the lower the benefits, the higher the costs and the risk. We've done it for too long. The wealth channel, the wealth effect, the financial asset channel, which is what the only way monetary policy acts on the economy, has a lot of distortive effects. And we are well beyond where we should be on that. So take our foot very gradually, very carefully off the monetary accelerator, and then press a different type of fiscal policy, press harder, much harder, pro-growth, pro-productivity structural reforms, and much harder public-private partnerships. And I think that sort of policy mix counters what is going to be what we're looking at right now, which is more inequality, less growth, and more financial instability down. So we've got the solutions, John. This is a political issue. This is not an engineering issue. It's not a design issue. This is an political implementation issue.
It's a little controversial, Mohamed, but do you think that the Fed's most recent aggressive monetary policy has contributed to income inequality?
Yes, I mean, I don't know how. So it's definitely a contribute to wealth inequality. Wealth inequality. Okay, income inequality is harder to argue, right? In fact, there is a view that by running the economy hot, you improve income inequality. You improve income inequality. That could really well be the case. There's better ways of doing it, but there could be better ways of doing it. But in my mind, it is unambiguous. In fact, it is an objective of the policy. I mean, understand how this policy works. The Fed cannot lower taxes, increase spending. The Fed cannot provide retraining, retooling to the labor force. The Fed cannot do education reform. It cannot do skill acquisitions. It cannot do infrastructure. It cannot do all the stuff we need. But what can the Fed do? It can take asset prices sky high, first by putting interest rates to zero or negative in the case of the ECB, and making us feel that there's no alternative to risk assets, because we want to get paid something. We have to earn some sort of return, especially if we're a pension fund and we have obligations. And then if that's not enough, it goes in and buys assets. And you and I know that there's nothing more reassuring to an investor than the knowledge that someone behind you is going to be buying, and that someone behind you has a printing press in the basement and is a non-commercial buyer. They're not price sensitive. That's great. And the hope is that by all this happening, asset prices go up, which they did. People come, get their 401k, they open it up, they're wealthier. You trigger the wealth effect. People go spend more because they're wealthier. And as they spend more, companies look and say, wow, demand is picking up. I better invest more. And then you unleash animal spirits. So you have the wealth effect, the animal spirits, and next thing you know, you've raised the economy. Well, we've had 10 years of that, and we know it does not work. It works really well in financial assets and in housing. We know that. But beyond that, it does not work. Okay, so you end up contributing to wealth inequality, but it's not a means to another end. It ends up being an end in itself. And that becomes problematic.
Should there be a third mandate for the Fed?
Oh, I think there is an implicit mandate, which is financial stability. But I must say that it hasn't been in focus. And the reason why is you've got to understand, what a central bank is like. I spent 15 years at the IMF. And the IMF is like a global central bank. Okay, it does the lender of last resort function to countries. And the very first thing you're taught when you join that institution is the following, quote, "We are not in the business of creating crises. We're in the business of avoiding crises." Okay, so that results in two things. Central banks will end up by not overreacting or not preemptively reacting to the threat of financial instability because they're afraid that they're going to cause it themselves. Okay, so it is there, but they want prudential approach to it. They don't want a proactive monetary policy approach. And then the second thing, it turns central banks into doctors. What's so special about a doctor? She or he will never walk away from the patient. If they don't have the absolutely right medication, they will give you whatever medication there is to buy you time until you get your surgery, until you get something, okay? And a central bank is like a doctor, never walks away from the patient. And even if they're giving medicine that's not the right one, they will continue giving it because that's their DNA. And if you wondered why, go back to the IMF. Why do you think the IMF always lends to Argentina? How often has Argentina been the problem child? Has the IMF ever walked away from Argentina? No, that's not what they do.
So this sounds like a coordinated effort. I mean, it is a coordinated effort. Does that coordination between legislatures and independent central banks concern you? Can you in a crisis have coordinated efforts and then in normal life go back to independence?
So we've had it. In fact, that first of all, let me tell you that I, and I had the chance at a context event, a wonderful context event, to interview Stephanie Kelton of the Modern Monetary Theory, MMT. And that modern monetary theory basically says central banks and fiscal should be one, right? Hand in hand, they go hand in hand. And a central bank should print money and fund deficits, et cetera, et cetera. And you heard me say, I'm with you part of the way, but I'm not with you all the way. I'm with you in part of there should be coordination, especially during crises. I'm with you that when interest rates are low for long, the speed limit for debt goes up. But I'm not with you beyond that point, okay? Because I think that central banks should be technocratic. Fiscal agencies are by definition political. And if you have a short political cycle, it is almost inevitable that that's going to dictate a lot of the policy making. Politicians, rightly so, understandably so, want to be reelected. And there are certain ways of being reelected. You run the economy too hot for a while. That's one way. Another way of being reelected is you don't pay attention to what are called structural reforms. You don't pay attention to measures that involve short-term sacrifice for long-term gain. Right? So we've got to be careful. You need some technocratic institutions in the system. Otherwise, it becomes a very short-term focus.
Mohamed, do you remain optimistic that, particularly in the U.S., that we can close this income and wealth gap without significant disruption?
I do. I think that you're seeing people starting to realize what you've often heard me say, John. Okay, and you've heard me say it for years to people, companies and wealthy people. You cannot be a good house in a bad neighborhood. Okay, if you have this notion that you can be the great house and you don't care about the neighborhood, well, let me warn you that that's not the case. The neighborhood will influence the house. You wouldn't buy a good house in a bad neighborhood. Do you really want to become a good house in a bad neighborhood? You've also heard me say over and over again, the people who work for you care about these issues. Whether it's the environment, whether it's governance, whether it is inequality, they really care. We have a new generation coming up who feel aggrieved. They feel that my generation has borrowed growth from their future. We've destroyed the planet. We have added to debt. And they are much more socially conscious than they are. And if businesses don't understand that, they're not going to be able to attract and retain the best talent they want.
It's a great answer. Let's go a little bit to the debt markets. You touched on this a little bit with our conversation with Stephanie Kelton and MMT, but Mohamed, it's obvious that we're going to deficit spend globally to try to correct this income and wealth imbalance, but to also, whether it's a new Green Deal or whether it's infrastructure on the right, the debt markets, the currency markets don't seem to mind at the moment. At what point and what are the early signs do the markets begin to care about the size of public debt?
So it's important to say markets don't care in most countries, but there are other countries where markets care, right? Argentina, markets care. Ecuador, markets care. Lebanon, markets care, right? So there is a point out there It is much further away if you issue debt in your domestic currency and if you're a reserve currency. Okay. But in general, I think that markets right now underestimate three threats. Okay, and for good reasons. We should talk about why the market conditioning is so strong, and I understand it. Right? It's like, a surfer on a surfboard on a huge wave in California. Does the surfer know it's going to break at some point? Yeah. Are they going to get off that wave early? No, of course not. It's really enjoyable, and we had more record levels yesterday. We're not going to get off this wave. We're going to need unambiguous evidence that wave is breaking before we get off it, because it has been so rewarding, so incredibly rewarding. So we're really conditioned to buy the dip. We're really conditioned that there's no alternative. The FOMO, the fear of missing out, is really, really strong. In the process, we are underestimating three risks. One is liquidity. We've assumed the system is much more liquid than it actually is. And rather than draw that lesson in March, when the treasury market was lacking liquidity, you and I know that, John, we know what it was like. We've drawn the wrong lesson, which is central banks will always provide liquidity. Okay. Well, you know what? There's certain parts that central banks can't get to. It's really important to remember that there's certain parts they cannot get to. And there's a lot of risk taking going on there. So the first risk that's being underestimated by markets is liquidity. The second risk that's being underestimated is a significant steepening of the yield curve. People think that central banks can control the whole yield curve unless they go into very clear yield curve targeting, which they can. I don't think they will, but they can. Okay, this yield curve is going to continue to steepen. And as it steepens, things are going to break. Okay, it doesn't require a change in monetary policy. It's really important for people to understand that. All it requires is for us to get through to the vaccine and for this economy to come back to 70, 80% operations. And then inflation expectations are going to shoot up. Okay, and that risk is really, really underappreciated in markets right now.
Yeah, I agree completely, Mohamed. The cross-asset liquidity gaps that we saw in March were just shocking. The most liquid assets in the world just dried up. How does the Fed begin to decondition market participants to this sense of what happened in March? The Fed stepped in and didn't just buy treasuries, they bought bonds, they bought corporate assets. Does the Fed, you can't wake up one day and just say, hey, by the way, we're no longer going to backstop the markets, you're on your own now. But what does that deconditioning process look like? How long does it take? And does the market, do you think they acclimate to that fairly smoothly? I'm sure there's a risk that they don't, but what do you think the most likely outcome is?
Do you remember what it was like when we used to take candy away from our toddlers? Okay, did they like it? No. Did we have to put up with, a few minutes of pain? Yeah. But was it the right thing to do? Yes. So look, there's been two attempts in the last 2 years, both incoming heads of central banks, Chair Powell and President Lagarde at the ECB. Both of them came in recognizing that this codependency between the Fed and the markets had gotten bad, that this notion that there's always a Fed put, not only a Fed put, okay, it was a Greenspan put, then a Bernanke put, then a Yellen put, and now a Powell put. It gets personalized, right? That's not a good thing, that markets don't function well. And a market-based system needs really well-functioning financial markets because they allocate capital. Let's not forget what a financial market is for. It's for allocating capital. So if you distort the financial market, you're going to pay for it. So both of them came in recognizing this, and both of them tried. And if you remember, Chair Powell tried, and then it took December 2018 when he did a huge U-turn. Madame Lagarde U-turned much earlier. She came in and said something along the lines of the ECB is not in the business of capping Italian yields. Within 48 hours, she was in the business of capping Italian yields. It is inevitable that the markets, just like a toddler, will yell and shout. Right? But that is not, policy is not determined by how loud the yelling is and the shouting is. Policy is determined, are you picking up market dysfunction and are you risking the economy? In neither U-turn cases were we picking that up, right? So, how we do it is carefully, very carefully. How we do it is quickly, in terms of you don't wait till the perfect situation because it's not going to come. And meanwhile, you're reinforcing and more people are taking more risk, which is more painful to unwind. And just have a very, very high level analysis of the functioning of markets. Was it a time to do this in March, April, May? No, of course not. It wasn't. Was it time to do that in September, October, November, December? Yeah, it was actually. Okay, but we didn't. Instead, we're going to, in fact, I expect the ECB tomorrow to press hard on the accelerator, and I expect the Fed is going to press hard on the accelerator. And let's not also forget that the Fed made this decision, which for me is a complete and utter puzzle, of buying high-yield bonds. The high-yield market wasn't dysfunctional at that time, right? I'm not quite sure what they were thinking, but now that they bought high-yield bond, I think a lot of people in the marketplace say, well, that they're taking on default risk, so what's stopping them from buying equities? And I think you've got to stop that behavior. It may make us feel good, like candy, like our kids with candy in the short term, but the after effects are not that great.
Mohamed, you're so good at distilling such complex concepts into great analogies, and it's very well said. Let's transition for just a couple minutes on current markets. We're all allocators of capital on this call, and I know, of course, you're not managing money these days. But when you look at the horizon, the 10-year horizon, when you think about how to allocate capital in an environment where interest rates are zero and in the short term or worse or lower and pegged, when you look at asset valuations through or equity valuations through something like a CAPE metric or a traditional P metric, you get one set of numbers, and you adjust them for interest rates, you might get a different set of numbers. What's the right framework, especially given what you just described, with these risks of liquidity and inflection points and policy? What's the right valuation framework to use to think about how to allocate capital over a long horizon?
So let me just say, I really feel sorry for everybody else that has to make decisions with other people's money. When I bump into my colleagues from PIMCO and they say how things are going, I say, you know what, I'm really glad that I don't have to decide, for a retirement fund or for, I would hate to be doing this right now, because I know what I would be doing. I would be holding my nose, right, and riding the wave, okay, because I would understand how deep the conditioning is, but I wouldn't. That's not how I like to invest. I like to invest because I can argue that the fundamentals, the valuation, I always look for at least 2 of 3 criteria. And right now, honestly, most risk assets don't satisfy any of them. You just are on the liquidity wave. Yeah. And that's not how I'd like to do it. So I don't have an easy answer other than to tell you that over the long term, you need to ask yourself a few questions. One is, what themes am I really betting on? Okay. If I'm betting on if my theme is the continuation of liquidity for 10 years, that's your time frame, that ain't a good theme. Okay. If my theme is on AI, is on big data, if my theme is on green technology, if my theme is on where the world is going, where the terminal value looks higher and for good reason, okay, that's a good way to invest. The second principle I always say is be honest recognize that you're likely to make a mistake at some point in that journey. Not the destination, but at least the journey. At some point, it's going to look like you've made a mistake. Is it a recoverable mistake? You and I know, John, that most mistakes in investment are recoverable with time. There's one that's not: total capital impairment. Okay, so be very honest about what mistake can you afford to make, which takes you to quickly, what is a recoverable mistake? What's a non-recoverable mistake? Ask yourself that question. I've been in many investment committees, and the minute you say, what is the mistake we cannot afford to make, people get really uncomfortable. It's hard enough to get them to talk about mistakes. They just want to talk about what goes well. And then the third thing I always tell to each other is, what resilience do you have? You've heard me say, in a perfect world, you want resilience, optionality, and agility. Okay, what's your resilience? Okay, point to the resilience of your investment. Okay, so those are the sort of principles that I'm guided by. But I can tell you, this is a really, really tricky time. It's a very, very tricky time.
It is indeed. It is indeed. When I won't hold you, Mohamed, but if you think about expected real return going out the horizon, what do you think that looks like in 10 years?
So I missed that first bit. What looking at for 10 years?
Can you hear that?
I can hear you on and off. I don't know if it's mine or yours.
I'm looking at a credit card. What do you expect 10-year real returns given in this environment?
I heard 10-year yields. Is that right?
Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. Is it 10-year yields you asked about?
I'm looking for the unanswerable question of what do you think real returns would look like out 10 years, given current asset prices for a diversified portfolio?
I don't know, but it's hard to believe that they're going to be the 7 to 8% that a lot of people are having.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, ironically, go to an asset class where this happens a lot. Okay. Emerging markets. The best secular returns happens when you avoid an accident and get back in immediately after the accident. Right. And I think that the best secular return will come when right now, in my days, you could have a structural investment-based hypothesis, you could have a secular investment-based hypothesis, and feel that you've done your job. Today, you need a tactically based investment hypothesis, right? And that tactically based is influencing and informing your other two decisions much more than it has ever done in the past. And when I say that, people say, oh, you want to turn me into a day trader. I said, no, I don't want you to turn into a day trader. I want you to appreciate market technicals. It's very different, right? So, I think the reality is that depending on when you start investing. So if you were to tell me you have to invest today for 10 years, and you give me an option that I can exercise that investment, same investment at any time over the next 12 months, I would pay a lot for that option because I think that we are going to get better entry points.
That's very well framed, Mohamed. That's very well framed. Completely agree. Just not sure where it is, but that option has an awful lot of value. Awful lot of value. Yeah, very well said. Mohamed, our time is short. I just want to say something personally. You've really had an extraordinary career, and your story is so inspiring. But what I find most impressive about you is your genuine humility and your humanness. You've been a leader, a global leader, but you've also been a very human person and very humble about that. And I greatly appreciate that. I have one last question for you. What one simple piece of advice would you give a younger Mohamed El-Erian, knowing what you know now about life?
So first of all, thank you for your kind words. It's funny because I'm much harder on myself than you'd ever imagine. I think that I could have done so much more with my life for others than I did, and I kick myself for not doing so. Look, I mean, I lack a lot of things, and I've lacked, believe it or not, self-confidence. I never put my hand up. When I remember, I started early. I remember being elected to be the captain of my college football team, soccer. Okay, it was the UK football team there, and I never put my hand up. It never occurred to me. That other people would want me to be captain. When I won the FT Business Book of the Year, it never occurred to me that I stood any chance of doing it. I was sitting in the room, and you'd think that I'd said, well, even if I have a 10% chance, I better have something to say when I get to the podium. It never occurred to me. So, I would say to myself, have a bit more self-confidence. Don't become arrogant, okay? Because arrogance, I don't think people quite realize how off-putting arrogance is to other teammates. But be a little bit more self-confident. That's what I would tell myself. But if I was to take the risk, the type 1, type 2, type 1 is be insufficiently self-confident, or type 2 be arrogant. I'd rather underwrite type 1 risk than type 2.
Once again, very, very well said, Mohamed. Thank you so much for your time, for doing this.
No, thank you. And I want to thank you and Mo for doing this, and for everybody else out there for what you do. There's a lot of pain and suffering out there. So thank you very, very much for what you're doing.